It's my pleasure to introduce the 2011 edition of the Curatorial Practice Graduate Symposium. My name is Julian Myers, and I'm an assistant professor in curatorial practice and visual studies at the school. And this year, Andrew Weiner and I served as the thesis advisors in that department. And so presenting here today are 8 candidates for MA degree in the graduate program. And what they'll present today is a version of their research and writing for their master's thesis, which along with the thesis exhibition serves as their requirement for that degree. These theses represent the culmination of a year of study, research, thinking, and writing at the cutting edge of the curatorial field. And this is a very melancholic moment for me in some ways. I've served as the thesis advisor with a number of people, including Jill Dawsey and Erica Levin and Anthony Gruden and Rennie Pritikin, but I have advised theses in this department for 8 years, which somehow my life is getting away from me. So I've done this since the very inception of the program, and it's been a practice that has been very much at the center of my teaching in that time. It's been very, very important to me, and the relationships that I built in that process, I think, are in the next year while I'll be on sabbatical, one of the things that I'll miss the most. And I thought that one of the ways, I thought that one of the things that I might do is actually to talk a little bit about what I would miss. And then to read a little bit from a piece that I wrote earlier this year, very much with this process in mind. So one of the things I'll miss most is learning from my students and working very closely with them. I'll miss the conversations we have in office hours and in things like this. And I'll miss learning from them, not just facts about things that I don't know, but also learning ideas, coming across ideas and thinking down a path with them. It's incredibly rewarding, and I feel like my brain is bursting with information about things that other people care about, and they made me care about as well. And that's something for which, the current year has been wonderful, and that goes for all of the preceding years as well. What I'll also miss is the process of criticism, critique. This is a fraught process, and it's difficult. And I take it as one of my very solemn responsibilities, as one of the most interesting and fun aspects of advising theses and teaching in general, to be thinking hard and critically about an idea and then saying what you think about it, saying if you think it works. And I think that process is one I take very seriously. It's one that I see as the very center, research on the one hand and critique on the other, as being the very center of teaching. There are moments, I know, for many of the people in this room where they've left my office cursing my name. I can only hope that this is accompanied by a kind of a bigger sense of the critical project, that we're both engaged in. And so I wanted to say a little bit now. I wanted to read a bit for you of a piece that I wrote for a magazine called Paper Monument, which is affiliated with N+1 in New York. I wrote it with a prompt that we were to write about assignments. We were to talk about an assignment and to give it about 500 words. And my students will know that this is a very funny thing because I ended up writing 1,500. I wrote it alongside a good friend and someone who's also taught on the program, Dominic Wilston, who's the curator of education at SF MoMA. And we wrote it as a response to an art historian and critic who meant a lot to us. And we read an essay by him from the early 1970s that I'd dug up, I think very randomly in an issue of Studio International, where there was a great debate on education. And of course, education is changing a lot these days. It's being handed over in many ways to processes of consumerism and commodification in various ways that all of us who care about education will be well aware of. And in some way, this was our response, and in some way, this was, it was written with my students in mind. So it's a letter to Charles Harrison, who is a critic who died actually in 2009, and so in some way, it's a little bit of a in memory of him. So, dear Charles, we are reading Educating Artists, pulled from a 1972 edition of Studio International that had seen better days, and very much enjoying your pungent criticisms of the art school mindset. Your essay is a broadside and a debate we can only grasp part way, and you might react with bemusement, if not horror, at the prospect of its disinterment 40 years on. Still, it spoke to us, and we thought we might respond. In many ways, it's surprising how little has changed since then. The idea that art school, which is where we are, the idea that art school merely encourages and assesses student self-expression still exists. This self-absorbed notion of art school as a pseudo-therapeutic institution, shaped by Skinnerian techniques of reinforcement and reward. It might even be the dominant notion of what art school is today, and we have as little patience for it as you did. You also, in your essay, elaborate critically on the idea of art school as a kind of nebulous, free space, deliberately left undefined so as to allow for maximum creativity and free play. As you describe it, and quoting him here, something close to a primary or elementary school open plan. It's a terrible fate, isn't it? One must believe in something like educational osmosis, where, quote, the central generative process of art education is one of perambulation in and around the art school by staff and students alike, punctuated by chance encounters. This isn't our take. In other ways, though, we feel somewhat detached from your concerns in the context you are addressing, the circumstances of art education in Britain in the early 1970s. It's long ago and far away. It's not easy for us even to reassemble what those circumstances were exactly. We grasped that old independent art schools were being incorporated into the polytechnics. Art schools were becoming art departments. We know, too, how issues of art education mattered to your art and language circle at the time, through projects like Posters for School and Schoolbook. And you've written elsewhere about how that circle suffered professionally from these transitions, though this trauma is well coded in educating artists. We understand, too, that just as partisans of the independent art schools felt these administrative changes to be a threat to their sense of the value of art, you saw grounds for optimism for the very same reasons. You surmised that ending the isolation of art schools held out the potential for ending the isolation of art, though it could mean, you thought it could mean that a body of theory might be enough to justify art practice, as with other disciplines in the Polytechnic, and argued that art education might borrow protocols from those other disciplines and thereby gain some possibility of order and priority. And in particular, you argued for a new kind of research-based practice on par with other academic activities. And this is very much one that I think we pursue in curatorial practice. And this new research, focus on research, might enable something you describe perhaps mischievously as social realism. Of course, you meant to evoke someone like Courbet or Diego Rivera, and not the Association of Artists of Revolutionary Russia. This seems to be the key passage for you. Insofar as art does indeed offer opportunities for access to and expression of some non-materialist modes of evaluation, its practices and priorities are of wide concern. The potential in terms of art education now seems to lie in the direction of finding a means to explicate rather than decorate the world. Social realism might come to mean something very different if only it could serve to describe an intellectual accomplishment rather than an ideological stance. So this is where, speaking now again to Charles, this is where we find ourselves estranged from your account of things as it was then. Not that we don't find the appeal of this agenda, we do. We would like to be able to argue for the explication and evaluation of the world as the method for art and writing about it. But what would that look like now as a program for the education of curators or artists? More concretely, what would one do in the classroom? What new kinds of questions must be posed, and with what sort of result in mind? More to your point, we might ask, from which polytechnic field might art education extrapolate its idea of research? Instinctively, we assumed you meant the social sciences, and we've seen where a version of this has led to something like art as ethnography, with its attendant ambiguities and pitfalls. But the example you call up in your essay is physics. Well, here the limits of our situation may constrain our imaginations and our appetite for the model offered by science. We do wonder if your idea that art school might borrow forms of assessment from other disciplines in the Polytechnic seems to lay the grounds for, or keeping your qualified optimism in mind, to dialectically invert the values of the reorganizing of the school system according to the dictates of finance, as it was happening in the 1970s and happening now. In hindsight, this looks rather more ominous, a grim episode of higher education's, quote, legitimation through performativity, this being Jean-François Lyotard's jargonistic description in the postmodern condition of the remaking of the project of education according to the demands of science and the market. Pedagogy will still exist, Lyotard allows, in these new conditions. Quote, the students would still have to be taught something, not contents, but how to use the terminals. This, of course, and I presume many of us will agree, is a sickening diagnosis compared to yours, and it's one that was incipient in the moment you were writing, but one that squares ever more precisely with the reformatting of more and more classrooms to the priorities of I-economy and e-education in the art school system and the Bologna Accords alike. The new legitimation you picture as possible in this Polytechnic is so easily reimagined by administrators as the transfer of marketable and accessible skills for a new breed of knowledge workers. No matter if that promise is often made by the art school with a certain amount of cynical reason. Perhaps we might respond with one of Art and Language's own exhortations for the art school context. Those paying, I'm quoting one of their exhortations, those paying lip service to the nostrums of cultural bureaucracy are vocationally depoliticized. Now back to our voice, we would march to that. And where do your suggestions lead us as teachers with a group of students? What would one do in the classroom? What would one assign students to do? We've been thinking about an experience one of us had teaching at an open university residential school around 1998. Of course, Charles Harrison, you were there, being the quiet, benevolent doyen of OU art history, playing French horn in the evenings. A particular group visit to the Tate Gallery included an ad hoc assignment which may or may not speak to your imaginings in 1972. The students were in a room full of Cy Twombly paintings, and a colleague, who had been approximately part of Art and Language, asked them which Twombly they thought was best. And these students refused to answer. They thought they were all junk. And so this is our answer to the assignment bit. And so this is the assignment of sorts. So this colleague asked them which was worst. And the group suddenly had many suggestions and could argue vividly why one was worse than the other. And as a result, this colleague was then able to point out that they could make and discuss aesthetic judgments about Twombly. So to know which Twombly in the room is worst or even best is not to know very much, we'd contend. But the assignment does open the question of judgment, as well as the crucial matter of criteria. Ordered and prioritized according to what? And perhaps answering that question will reveal nothing more or nothing less than the class character of the students themselves. And whether this is a useful revelation would depend on what was done with that knowledge. By the way, and here's something only you would be able to confirm or deny, the OU colleague claimed that this assignment originated in the turn of art and language away from strict conceptualism to questions of aesthetics, around the time, 1980, of the portraits of V.I. Lenin in the style of Jackson Pollock. Was that turn motivated by what was happening to higher education in the 1970s? Did you begin to suspect that if art was remade as a cognitive discipline, it would be handed over to the accountants? We surprise ourselves by having more confidence, more hope for art as research, we suspect, than you've had for decades. It's not that we would want educating artists to be like an education in science, but what would happen if we viewed practice in art schools as if it was research? What transformations or shifts in register might result? A few things come to mind in tune with your suggestions from 1972. And this speaks to the kinds of research that I think all of our presenters have done today. First, research is a collective endeavor. It adds something to what others have done and will do. And in this, it opposes the terrible individualism on which art school so often still seems to insist. Research, too, is meant to be arguable, contestable, as the assignment of deciding the worst Twombly points up. That is, research is opposed to a kind of art so prevalent in art school that is validated by its self-expression, sincerity of effort, or worse, by sheer quantity. And indeed, your art theory courses were marked in contrast by the careful, glacial pace of their production. We also have in mind your reference in A Provisional History of Art and Language from 1982 to art students' heuristic activity, that is, learning through experience, trial and error, and experimentation. So, what would a truly heuristic research look like? It might produce something very distinct from those pseudo-objective, ultra-professionalized, over-administered, essentially unquestioning investigations that prevail elsewhere in the academy. And certainly some such shift in register would be necessary should we want art schools to do something other than reflect the system they serve so well, whose highest values they enshrine, whose noblest aspirations they foster, and whose most liberal principles they exemplify. And for us, this remains a worthwhile prospect. All our best, Dom and Julian. So, with that very weird preamble, I think I'm going to introduce Aaron Fletcher, who's going to present on a project where this kind of research is actually a key issue. And we'll have 4 presentations lasting each about 20 minutes. And at the end, we'll have time both for discussion, which I'll moderate, and questions from all of you, which I hope you'll cultivate while you're listening. So, Aaron, thank you.
Thank you, Julian, and thanks everybody for coming. I'd like to begin framing this panel by introducing the event as something which can be concurrently dispersed and whole. Behind the title of this slide, you'll notice a calendar that charts out the 10 performances and 30 related programs, which comprise Suzanne Lacey's 3 Weeks in May, taking place in 1977 in Los Angeles. This event was was fundamentally a citywide exhibition of performance. It was strikingly postmodern in that it presented multiple performances with heterogeneous approaches and time spans in a variety of locations as a collective whole. My interest in this event lies in the interdependence between its aesthetics and political elements. To understand it completely, neither can be privileged. And here, I'd like to alert everybody that the slides I will be presenting are visually and emotionally very charged. In 1977, Los Angeles was the rape capital of the United States, with incidents tripling the national average. 3 Weeks in May was conceived as a performative event which would raise awareness around this issue that had been rendered virtually invisible in the dominant social and political context. Lacey's investment in addressing rape developed from the body politics and consciousness-raising sessions which were key to feminism. The emerging feminist art movement aimed to redress the fact, as stated by Lucy Lepard, that there were virtually no women in the art world. With the goal of creating their own representation, feminist artists such as Carolee Schneemann, Judy Chicago, Sheila Lavrant de Bretteville, and many others set precedents for women artists to reclaim the subjective experience of their sexuality. During 3 Weeks in May, Lacey collaborated with performance artists Leslie Labowitz, Dina Metzger, Laura Klick, Sherry Galkey, Barbara Smith, Anne Galden, France, and Judith Lostchild. These artists had all worked together at the Women's Building in Los Angeles, where a unique style of performance art was developing. This style was more collaborative, more focused on pedagogy, and less market-oriented than the dominant strain of feminist art emerging from New York. Lacey shared the belief with other artists in the movement that the content and that the social relevance of her work were just as essential as the form. 3 Weeks in May became a benchmark in Los Angeles performance art because it challenged the personally cathartic feminist performances created for a small audience to move into public space and addressed artistic and social issues in a public forum. Using her skills as a community organizer, Lacey created a network of civic entities and community partners which were supportive of the event. The live bodies of the performers and their works bore witness to the effects of the social context by which they were shaped. These performances acted as an interruption to the silence surrounding rape in the city for a short period of time. In this presentation, I will focus on the aspects of 3 of the main performances to explore their various models of approach and evaluate their degrees of success within the collective whole. In this image, we're looking at a focused view of Suzanne Lacey and her process-based performance in the City Mall. Lacey is stamping a map of Los Angeles, as she did every morning throughout 3 weeks of the event. Each day, she collected statistics of the former day's rape reports from the police department. Then, the sites of the rape were located on the map, one by one, and marked. Using a large stamp, which read rape, Lacey pressed dark red ink into the map 1 time for each reported rape, and in light red ink 9 times to symbolize the estimated number of rapes which went unreported. This act of stamping was a repeatable and unchangeable gesture, alluding to the impersonal stamping of official documents. Observers were meant to view these stamps as a collection of marks which slowly built up. Progressing in real time, these markings morphed over the weeks from being individually distinguishable to being a stain which bled across the map and obscured it. Lacey chose the map as a background because it would increase the specificity of the incidents to the audience, heightening the real and imperative nature of the crimes. This is a quote from her. There was also a second map installed alongside the first, which featured places women could go to seek counseling or to get immediate help. This map was installed based on Lacey's feeling of ethical obligation to her audience, another important understanding in feminist performance art. These maps were based on blueprints found in the fire department's cartography unit and displayed Los Angeles and the surrounding areas. They were lined with caution tape, while the wall behind them was covered with asphalt paper to symbolize the street. And they characterized the street as such. They characterized the street as a site of danger, as it was a contact point between many women and their attackers. Due to the size, 25 feet long each, passerby could identify the streets and the areas of the city. And two important notes need to be made here. First, the map framed rape within the city, drawing attention to it not as a singular act, but as a larger societal problem which infected every borough of Los Angeles. Second, by making the works large enough that viewers could identify neighborhoods and streets where they may have lived, worked, or gone out, the awareness of rape in these spaces became shockingly personal. Shifting the tone of the wider social environment was the basis for Lacey's interactions with the space of the city. The maps were installed in a passageway where they would have likely been encountered by business people on their lunch breaks. Lacey wanted to confront viewers with statistical information that would force them to question why rape was not in their realm of conscious concern. She believed that a new awareness would help uproot incorrect social stigmas about rape and identify it as a crime. However, 3 Weeks in May lacked the measurable objectives that would have taken it from an artwork into the realm of a campaign. Neither did it seek a presence within the city beyond the 3 weeks of its existence. This was largely due to Lacey's interpretation of Alan Capro's idea that political art should maintain an identity of ambiguity and purpose. By using this philosophy to keep the event open-ended politically, it was tremendously successful in creating empathy across political and social lines. This disorienting and disturbing snapshot is taken from the ground looking up. It documents She Who Could Fly, Lacey's performative installation conceived in 3 parts for an art audience at the Garage Gallery in LA from the 20th to the 21st of May. This work attempted to depict a visceral and emotionally traumatic experience of rape while also creating a sense of solidarity and agency for audience members and performers. The work contained many bold moments and also has the most problems of any work in the entire event. However, for this reason, it is interesting to explore. On May 20th, the opening night, Lacey acted as a host, directing instead of participating in the performance. She invited visitors into the small single room of the gallery and encouraged them to help create the installation by recording their personal rape stories, if they had them and chose to do so, on index cards. At first glance, this appears to be an invasive request bordering on inappropriate, and it was likely terrifying to the women who chose to participate. The boldness of this request, especially in 1977, can be illustrated by a comparison. In the draft of her book about 3 weeks, Lacey recalls developing an art project with Judy Chicago 6 years earlier, in 1971, that would have tape recorded and shared women's rape experiences. Lacey notes that women who would have participated in the project were hard to find. They didn't want to talk. The rapes had been hidden for years from family, friends, and even husbands. By 1977, there was a greater awareness among feminists about the problem of rape, but the subject was still largely closeted. It is unclear how Lacey coached her potential participants, but given the evidence, this could have been the first time they had ever been asked, or given the opportunity, to share their stories. Writing these stories down had cathartic potential. Women could release a secret and begin to alleviate the sense of shame and isolation which often accompanied this experience. These cards were then affixed to the maps of the United States, which lined the walls of the gallery, with each card placed over the location where the rape had occurred. Unlike the stamps on the map in the city mall, the index cards created human traces across the standardized maps hanging in the gallery. In this way, the audience helped to shape the aesthetic of She Who Could Fly, marking an interaction between audience and artists not seen in the other performances. The second part of this performance was a private ritual, which was orchestrated by Lacey for her 4 performers, Nancy Angelo, Laura Click, Melissa Hoffman, and Cheryl Williams. Each of the performers had direct experience with sexual violence. Often incorporated into feminist performance, the role of ritual was to knit a community together, create a social bond, and the continuity thus established was the solace and the healing power promised by ritual. Thus, this performance was also a moment in which the artists sought solidarity in and release from their own experiences with rape, using ritual as a mode of creating a safe emotional environment in which to perform. Before opening to the public, they shared their stories, prepared the space, and had a moment of silence. When the gallery opened to visitors for the last incarnation of She Who Could Fly, Angelo, Click, Hoffman, and Williams were not immediately visible, only allowed into the gallery 3 and 4 at a time. Visitors probably moved to the index cards first, which lined the walls at eye level. Upon looking up, they would have been forced to confront the spectacle of a lamb carcass with wings affixed, hovering in the middle of the room. In Christian iconography, the lamb symbolizes Jesus, an innocent martyred for others' sins. The 4 performers, naked, crouched, and covered in red grease paint, were perched on a beam above the carcass, staring down at visitors who gradually became aware that they were being watched. This installation and performance was meant to evoke an image of how many women leave their bodies during a rape, a common mechanism for coping with trauma. Through contemporary eyes, these images are achingly earnest and also reductively blatant. However, at the time, this visceral and disturbing spectacle aimed to combat the silence and visual culture around the subjective experience of this widespread phenomenon. The watchful and accusatory gaze of the 4 performers, perched above the gallery viewers, is another problematic component of this work. By reversing the gaze from performer to viewer, the performers became the judges of the visitors, effectively flipping the power roles in a gallery setting. However, what role was cast on the audience as the recipients of this accusatory gaze? Many of the visitors were probably also the women who had shared their stories on the index cards. Yet, they were also likely the ones to be confronted by a horrifying spectacle which seemed to indict them. Was the audience to whom Lacey had offered solidarity and catharsis to be emboldened by an angry gaze directed at them? In seeking to create an interpretation of the experience of rape, which would resist the definition of women as passive victims, Lacey ironically turns her audience into victims. And the piece as a whole lacks the subtlety and sensitivity towards her audience that are featured in her maps much better. This still is taken from the beginning of one of Leslie Labowitz's series of 4 street performances titled Myths of Rape, which ran 1 per day for the last 4 days of 3 weeks in May. Labowitz's interest in political art had spurred her to move outside a gallery setting, where she felt her work would have been judged only on its aesthetics and its value as a commodity. Street performances shared the space in the city mall with Lacey's maps. However, her engagement with this space was markedly different from Lacey's methods of raising awareness. In an approach borrowed from Bertolt Brecht, Labowitz used the distance between the imagery in her performances and that of the commodity-driven space of the mall to activate her audience, which can be observed through an analysis of this image. A female performer, prone on the ground in front of the show window of a dress shop, calls attention to herself by lying in a walkway. Her eyes are bound with gauze, her legs are open, her arms are splayed, as if she had been struck or stunned. This pose is anachronistic with the codes of behavior and the assumption of safety in a public place. Exacerbating this uneasy spectacle, her head and eyes are bandaged. In the wrapping around her head, she has placed the handle of a protest sign. Anchored, the handle rises perpendicular to the length of her body, ending in a sign at the top which rises above her like a headstone and reads, "Myth, it could never happen to me. Reality, any woman at any age, race, status is potential rape victim. Occurs to women from," and this word is unreadable, probably birth, to 93 years old. 1 out of 3 women will be raped in her lifetime. The words on the sign are inflammatory because they suggest that in the mall, in the middle of the day, women are not safe. This is doubly jarring because the window behind the performer contains 2 dress forms, one displaying a wedding dress and the other an upscale evening dress, symbols of the safety promised to women by marriage and safety offered by class, both of which are waiting to be bought. The performer is violating the social codes of this public space on several levels. 2 shop attendants, one of them fashionably dressed for the 70s, stand right inside the threshold of the door frame, which marks the entrance to the shop. One has her arms crossed, the other has them folded in front of her chest, conveying reproach or irritation as they stare at the performer. Clearly, this was intentional, but it also makes the women uncomfortable and possibly angry. Why should she be calling attention to them? Why are they implicated when they are just going about their daily work life? How are they to process the painful message written on that sign? Will she get them in trouble? A blurred woman in the lower right-hand corner of this photo is quickly walking past the store. All of these questions are exactly the point. In that moment of unease, Labowitz created a window where her audience could pause and evaluate the space between themselves and the actions in the performance. Myths of Rape concluded when the performers, who had been stationed in separate locations throughout the mall, took up their signs and filed outside, emulating a demonstration. Here, the performance of protest replaces the actual staging of a protest itself. Labowitz recognized that protest was an emblem of resistance much as an act, and that this iconography was highly legible for a decade that followed on the heels of the 1960s. Of the visual imagery employed in 3 weeks, it is this image which has the most direct relevance to contemporary visual practice, particularly the performance by artist Sharon Hayes from In the Near Future 2005. In this performance, which I'll describe, Hayes stood on a sidewalk in New York City and held up a protest sign every hour for 9 hours. The text on these signs were taken from significant American protests, but as they were out of context, they left passerby with no idea as to their purpose. However, the ambiguity of this text in relation to its context becomes its own political weapon, evoking current rereadings of the text on the sign. A sign stating, for example, "I am a man," which is held by a woman, has a completely different reading from the point of view of contemporary queer activism than it did for the 1968 sanitation strikers. To conclude, 3 Weeks in May has contemporary significance as a model for socially engaged exhibitions of performance. Due to its ephemerality and reliance on context, live political performance is at a particularly high risk of being emptied of its content in order to preserve its form. One of the legacies of feminist art is to resist the impetus to divorce the aesthetics of performance from the social context which helps to shape it. Considered as an exhibition, 3 Weeks in May was successful because it was attuned to the social climate and the specific geographic place in which it was situated. As an exhibition model, Lacey's 3 Weeks created an open structure that allowed artists to develop ideas inside of it, permitting them to select their own location and designate their own audience. It instituted a loosely collaborative form in which most of the parts could be approached separately and understood as part of a whole. Finally, it situated all the works in the context where they would have the greatest relevance, and used community organizing to create a supportive network which helped to realize the project. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My thesis is titled On Life Performance and Invasion Performance, Eleanor Anton's Black Ballerina and Lorraine O'Grady's Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire. It takes on two performance works that similarly addressed racial and fictional identities that were created around the same moment at the onset of the 1980s. They have never before been critically linked, and although their performative approach differed substantially, my aim has been to historicize them in relation to one another, to couple them, so to speak, so that at least this small audience could view the works as parallel explorations of the self. Following in the footsteps of Adrian Piper, Anton and O'Grady's performances preceded a discussion about identity politics and visual arts discourse. The extended version of my thesis is equally concerned with mapping out the critical response to the Mademoiselle and to the Black Ballerina in order to gain a sense of how they were interpreted 30 years ago. Furthermore, I want to provide contextualization for these historically relevant works as a curator grappling with the problematics of representing performance, seeking to interpret them now. Around 1980, New York City witnessed two unique explorations of race and identity when performance artists Eleanor Anton on the left and Lorraine O'Grady developed two distinct personae in order to protest an obvious lack of minority presence in the mainstream art world. Beginning in 1979, Anton developed the Black Ballerina, a tragic and aged former ballet russe dancer fallen from grace. The artist thus adopted a performative identity that she would occupy for the next 12 years, finally retiring the character in 1991. After an accidental encounter with the Black Ballerina performance in 1980, O'Grady, a late-blooming artist, was compelled to make her first venture into the performative realm as the fictional debutante Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire. The two artists behind the Black Ballerina and the Mademoiselle shared aims of access as women in a predominantly male forum, but their desires were divergent. For O'Grady, it was about a double access to the art system, as a woman and as a woman of color. For Anton, her persona marked the artist's most extreme attempt at self-exploration using another identity as a vehicle. Coming towards the end of second-wave feminism, both artists were seeking to incorporate themselves into a homogeneous cultural landscape. Ultimately, both Anton and O'Grady were confronting a creative economy that was reluctant to incorporate their contributions as Black women, except that one of these Black women was white, while the other spoke directly from a lived experience. Where these performances further deviated was in their staging. Many of Anton's performances as Eleonora Antonova functioned as theater plays, scripted and presented to a limited invited audience, and later briefly for an unaware public. But beyond theater, the Black Ballerina was a life performance. Anton was conflating her own life with that of her characters to such an extreme that she is described managing only to crawl out of the persona in 91. Alternately, Lorraine O'Grady's self-described invasion performances commanded the attention of an unsuspecting art audience. The Mademoiselle would show up uninvited and unannounced to art openings. Her performances hit hard and fast, far less about the durational theatrical constructs than about the impact of protest. Formally speaking, these two personae epitomize classical notions of femininity and its display. The pageant queen with the perma-smile, eager to solicit approval from her audience, and the ballerina, rigorously trained in the art of controlling her body. By juxtaposing these performances, I want to expose the overarching connections between them in order to identify not only a formal or aesthetic relationship between the two, but to interrogate their effectiveness as critique as well. The Black Ballerina was a unique hybridization of two sects of performance: art as life and performance as theater. The last in an installment of 3 major personae, which included the king and the nurse, Anton produced an incredibly complex narrative for the Black ballerina, giving her the name Eleonora Antonova and fleshing out her imaginary life and history in photographs, drawings, scripted plays, and a journal entitled Being Antonova, which chronicled the 3 weeks the artist spent living as her character in New York City. Recollections of My Life with Diaghilev was an exhibition and performance staged 15 times in various institutions and galleries between 1980 and 1987. My analysis of the Black ballerina performance focuses heavily on this particular performance as it directly relates to Anton living publicly as the persona for those few weeks. Anton performed as Antonova in Recollections between October 23rd and 29th during her solo exhibition of the same name at Ronald Feldman Fine Arts. Seated before a limited audience over the course of 4 evenings, Antonova, wearing black face paint, a simple black evening dress, hair and nails perfectly manicured for the occasion, would spend nearly an hour reading from her memoir and recounting nostalgic stories about the days she had danced for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. Surrounded by lush plants, oriental rugs, and with a carafe of sherry on hand, Antonova's accoutrements were there to communicate the grande dame's status. In order to play this aged Black ballerina, Anton painted her face with makeup to pass as black. Before each performance, and specifically for the 3 weeks living as the ballerina, Anton would spend approximately 2 hours each morning applying makeup to darken her face. As evidenced in a lengthy description of this process in the Being Antonova journal, it was a ritual that Anton delighted in. The application of makeup seemed to mimic for her the action of painting on canvas, marking a pleasant return to Anton's earlier art making. There is often praise for the complexity of the Black ballerina character and the project in reviews published between 1979 and 1981. Many reviews laud the work for its complexity and Anton for her ability to strike a balance between the potentially transgressive nature of the character and the poignancy of her narrative. For critic Howard Fox, who has written extensively about Eleanor Anton's practice, Antonova exemplifies the ultimate postmodern, post-structuralist performance. The character defied simple categorization. It was fantasy, theater, reality, the contemporary and historical all at once. But so few critics, even those who have written more currently about this chapter of Anton's artistic production, dare to really linger on the issue of race, to ask pointed questions about the use of Antonova as a means to address the marginalization of Black artists at this time. From our contemporary moment, it seems bizarre enough that Anton did and even could successfully, and without much public backlash, play Black. But beyond her arguably naive attempt to understand and absorb the implications of Blackness, what was Anton trying to accomplish or investigate through her performances as Antonova? Was she challenging, as Lorraine O'Grady was, a predominantly white audience to look more critically at the well-established art world hierarchy that ignored the minority presence, a hierarchy still held firmly in place in 1980? Or perhaps, as some critics have claimed, Anton's performance was more aligned with her own agenda, seeking expression as a Jewish woman of Polish descent, attempting to navigate this same hierarchy, using Blackness as a vehicle for this expression. For O'Grady, witnessing Anton speaking for her experience signaled a necessary shift in the representation of artists of color operating within this art system. She introduced Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, a fictional debutante on a diatribe against the mainstream art world in 1980. The artist had decided that, via her own persona, she would protest the cultural atmosphere that had allowed for Anton to comfortably encroach upon her own actual experience as a Black woman via what she has coined invasion performances. The Mademoiselle made her debut at just above Midtown Gallery in Manhattan around the same moment that Anton was embarking on a 3-week period living as Antonova. Translated as Miss Black Middle Class, the Mademoiselle won her title sash in an imaginary worldwide event held in Cayenne, capital of French Guiana, in 1955. The character had an elaborate costume that included a sash, tiara, and long white gloves. The highlight of it all, though, was the dress that O'Grady created herself. Constructed of 180 pairs of vintage white gloves, it was the perfect metaphor for the debutante's 25 years of polite silence, little white hands that pushed against and contained her black body. In the most poetic sense, the layering of gloves acted as layers of the history of racial power dynamics, the expectation for black people to keep smiling, to wait silently and patiently for their turn. While the white gloves surely also reference the black laboring class, they refer to what O'Grady disapprovingly identified as the careful art that she felt was being made by her peers at that time. O'Grady's first Invasion performance was presented at the Black Avant-Garde Gallery just above Midtown, also known as JAM, in June 1980, and then again in September 1981, at the reception for the recently launched new museum. The show was a 9-person, all-white exhibition entitled Persona, to which O'Grady was not invited to, and Eleanor Antin was one of the 9 artists included. Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire condemned JAM and its roster of African-American artists, which included David Hammonds, Howardina Pendell, and Fred Wilson, among others, for offering a compliant, sterilized version of abstract black art in another recently opened exhibition entitled Afro-American Abstraction, a group exhibit held at the PS1 in New York, for which JAM had recommended many of its own artists. For the new museum Invasion performance, the Mademoiselle criticized the institution for excluding black artists from their programming, as was evidenced in Persona, which had only served to reinforce a grossly imbalanced art culture. Led in by a disco band, photographers, cameramen, and her guests, the Mademoiselle in her impressive costume captured the attention of everyone in the room. After distributing 4 dozen white chrysanthemums while parading around in a tiara and pageant-worthy smiles, the band would come to a break, and the beauty queen would remove her cape, cracking her whip against her body as she exclaimed, "That's enough. No more boot-looking, no more ass-kissing, no more buttering up, no more posturing of super-assimilates. Black art must take more risks." Where Antin's black ballerina was quietly inserted into invented and actual histories, O'Grady's Mademoiselle loudly demanded access to a system that denied her entry, taking back the power to speak for herself and for her community. Though both artists developed their personae to address a contemporary racial discourse, I maintain that O'Grady's invasionary tactic was necessary as a minority operating within this culture at that time. Had the artist asked for permission from the new museum or JAM to perform the work, she may have been denied entry, symbolic of the very issue of access and inclusion that this work addressed. When comparing Antin's ballerina with Lorraine O'Grady's Mademoiselle, the natural assumption is that O'Grady's performance was the most authentic performance, as the artist is essentially the character she inhabits. A woman of color attempting to navigate the relatively closed and predominantly white New York City art world, O'Grady spoke from a very personal and frustrated impulse. Her experience as a minority ostensibly granted her an authority on the subject, but there is a danger in reading her performance via that logic alone. As social theorist Joan W. Scott rightfully protests, to read a work in this way, and here my emphasis is in regard to O'Grady, to rely exclusively on O'Grady's personal experience as evidence of the performance's authenticity would be a mistake. To do so would only naturalize the difference of her experience as a minority, ultimately essentializing the artist. This is exactly what O'Grady wanted to avoid, and this is exactly the logic that Antin was operating against. Perhaps in a way, then, Antin's black ballerina persona was a productive critical act. It truly complicated the notion of shared identities within an identity politic, whereby people are conceivably defined by coded identities. By remapping a quasi-fictional black history onto her white body, Antin's performance completely rejected this expectation of the imprint of experience. What makes her character performance so complex and opaque beyond the fundamental elements is that Antin was not necessarily seeking to call attention to the inequity of black experience via an overt language of political protest. Furthermore, the artist has never explicitly stated that the black ballerina was a political piece, only that her personae were a means of, quote, dealing with a lot of the political and social issues that were of interest, unquote, to her. By connecting these two performances from this specific moment in art history, I've sought to supplement the lack of contemporary analysis on them. For O'Grady, the critical shift would come in 2007 with the exhibition WAC, Art and the Feminist Revolution, held first at the Geffen Contemporary at MoCA, Los Angeles, and later at MoMA PS1 in New York, for which we're looking at an image of. The Mademoiselle's dress was exhibited as part of this comprehensive survey of feminist art, having been borrowed from the Norton Foundation, who absorbed the costume into its collection in the mid-90s. O'Grady was featured in an array of programming surrounding the exhibition, including audio tours, lectures, blogs, and interviews. As for the Black Ballerina, she will finally be treated with an expanded critical analysis in Cherise Smith's publication, Enacting Others, Politics of Identity in Eleanor Antin, Nikki S. Lee, Adrian Piper, and Anne DeVere Smith, released in February of this year. But as a curator seeking to further analyze these important performances, the question of representing this material in an exhibition context is raised. How does one sufficiently represent these ephemeral acts, let alone do justice to this particular cultural moment and the issues raised without being hyperbolic? Via an analysis of the intentions behind these performances, alongside a consideration of their implications, we are able to reevaluate our own contemporary position and our relation to this history of concepts of racial identity in art. By rethinking these performances as curators, the issue then also becomes about the presentation of performance. It is our obligation to the work's history that we ensure those reading them today grasp their implications and the context within which they were created, why they mattered then, and why they matter now.